Yes, welcome to the New South Wales Active MedTech Community. If you're on this webinar, there's a good chance that you already know what the community is all about. But just to summarise, we are planning to run a series of educational events, primarily webinars, every fortnight on the first and third Wednesday of every month. And the initial and also we'll be running some face-to-face meetings as well, and I'll tell you about those at the end of the this session. But the webinar program to begin with is going to be very high level. In fact, this particular webinar is going to be a broad brush overview of the entire sector, I guess, and then we will get progressively more detailed. So the next webinar in a fortnight will be on the whole regulatory space, and that in itself will be a broad brush of the regulatory area. And throughout the course of the year, we're going to get more and more detailed, hopefully with the idea of developing a repository of recordings that people can find via our website and view at their leisure. I just wanted to acknowledge the two sponsors of the community. You can see on the bottom of the screen there, the Genesis Electronics Design. And just to declare that I am actually the marketing manager and business development manager for Genesis Design. And they're paying my way, I guess, to organise this community. And also Circuitwise Electronics Manufacturing, who I likewise work for as a marketing manager. And these two companies work closely together in developing medical devices. They are both certified to ISO 13485, which you'll hear about more in a minute, to develop, design and manufacture electronic devices combined. So today in this first webinar, we are going to do an introduction to active medtech. I will be taking you through that. My name's Dr. Tim Canagita at the bottom there. As I said, the coordinator of the community. I've got a background in engineering as well, and Internet of Things engineering before coming into medtech. Jeff Sizer is the CEO of Genesis and the immediate past chair of the ITEE College at Engineers Australia. And Jeff has over 30 years of experience in electronic design, and over the past 5 years or so, it's been really starting to specialise into the medtech space. So let's begin. What is an active medical device? I guess the first question you should ask yourself before you try to clarify what an active device is in any cases to understand, is a device actually a medical device? We get quite a number of inquiries coming through our door of people wanting to develop devices. Some of those people are in ignorance of the fact that it may be a medical device, and others are come in thinking it's a medical device, and in fact it isn't. So that is something you need to clarify up front. Jeff will give an example of that in a moment. But primarily what we're talking about when we talk about an active device, and this really differentiates it from other medical devices which may be inert or even pharmaceutical technologies, which are often considered medical technology. Active medtech runs on an energy source of some sort, usually. By internal and external, we usually mean it's either battery powered or plugged into the mains. It's important to note that any accessories connected to that device, including any remote software that's important in the running of that device, is also a medical device, even if it's sort of completely independent. So it's another subject that we'll be delving into later about software as a medical device on its own, in its own right. But the main thing that really differentiates active medtech from a whole range of other technologies is the higher burden of regulatory burden around safety. Obviously, anything with electricity has its own requirements that would be standard to any electronic device. but the burden of regulatory compliance is much, much higher for medical devices. And beyond that, there are a whole range of other regulations associated with these around EMC, which is electromagnetic compatibility. That's that annoying sound when you're driving along the freeway and suddenly your car radio goes haywire because some electronic or electrical system is bleeding radio waves and interfering with other devices. So you have an obligation that your medical device isn't going to interfere with other devices. And also vice versa, if it's a medical device, you want to be immune to the interference of other devices. So that's another aspect of that. And of course, a lot of electronic devices, most in fact these days, have some sort of radio frequency communications to them, which have a whole lot of licensing and regulations around that. Jeff, is there anything you want to add to that?
Oh, hi everyone, it's Jeff Sizer here. I think Tim's covered the headline issues pretty well in terms of an active medtech device, but I will make the comment, and I will expand on this shortly, that whether a device is a medical device or not very much depends on what it's used for. So you can have devices that may be a medical device in some uses, and the very same device may not be considered a medical device in other cases. It's important to draw this distinction.
So on this page, which we've just given some examples of products, excuse me, that Genesis and Circlewise have both been involved in. You might like to point out an example of that, Jeff.
Well, all the devices on the screen, other than the one in the right-hand bottom corner, are clearly medical devices. They're used in clinics or in operating theatres and are distinct as medical devices. But the elderly home monitoring is an interesting case. If it is used purely for keeping track of an elderly person to make sure they're up and around and moving and going through their normal daily routine to be monitored by their nearest and dearest loved ones, that is not a medical device scenario. But if you start to think about monitoring an elderly person in their home with a fall detection device or something that would alert a first responder in the event of that person having a problem, that starts to enter the domain of a medical device. So the very self-same product may or may not be a medical device, depending on where it's used and how it's used.
So generally speaking, medical devices are those that perform some sort of diagnostic, monitoring, or treatment of medical conditions, which clearly those other ones do. So if you've decided that your medical device, your device is in fact a medical device, then one of the first things you need to do is to understand what classification the device might be. And Jeff, could you just run us through what the different classes are?
Well, the classes range from class 1 for benign low-risk devices through to class 3 for implantable high-risk devices. And there's no easy distinction to say what the classification of a device is other than its risk profile. It's well beyond the scope of today's discussion to try and expand upon that any further, but there is good guidance available, in particular for the TGA for Australia from their website. It becomes a little more difficult for FDA for the US or CE for Europe, UK, but the bottom line is seek advice. It's really not appropriate for anyone other than an expert to make this determination, and the regulatory burden, depending on the device classification, can vary enormously.
So having worked out what classification your device is, then you need to really, I guess, begin with the end in mind, in that you are going to want to create a device that satisfies the regulatory requirements for that device. And in the active space, there are, as we said, there's a whole range of electronic and electrical standards that relate to these particular devices. So the first real question that I guess is a strategic question is to decide what route you are going to take to get to that compliance. Because generally speaking, what developers do is they choose one jurisdiction in which to get their device registered and compliant with the appropriate regulatory standards. In Australia, that's the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and some companies may choose to get it certified in Australia, and then that certification is mutually recognised by other countries such as the US, which is the Federal Drug Administration, CE mark in Europe. Jeff, any comments on what the trend is these days? It's been complicated by Brexit, I understand.
It's been complicated by Brexit. It's been complicated by medical device regulation causing the backlog in Europe. The bottom line is the FDA pathway for US and North America is in fact its own thing, and CE for Europe and UK is now in doubt, but certainly for Europe, and it was applicable to UK, is its own pathway. The TGA for Australia originally would recognise CE approval for Europe, but they are now also recognising FDA approval. So it's quite often an easiest pathway to get a product into Australia is to target either FDA or for US or CE for Europe and piggyback on that for TGA for Australia. Ironically, although the FDA had been considered the higher bar to jump, it is now probably the most accessible regulatory pathway because of the difficulties in Europe caused by the medical device regulation. I'm starting to throw a lot of terms and buzzwords around here, all of which are a whole webinar in their own right. So yeah. Bear with me on this.
So we'll, the next webinar in a fortnight's time, we'll be covering more on the regulatory side of things. Generally speaking, what people do once they've got an idea and they've worked out a general strategy for how they're going to develop their device is it's very natural to want to go ahead and quickly build a proof of concept to show people, investors, and so forth, that their concept can actually work and has some sort of validation, validity to it. But there is a whole spectrum of devices as you move through what we call minimum viable product and what we at Genesis call maximum viable architecture, which is to really understand the roadmap of where your product's going to go from a systems architecture point of view, and thinking about, again, starting with the end in mind about where your product's going to go and what can you do at the early stages to make the whole process, development process, as efficient and effective as possible. Jeff, do you want to comment on the difference between a proof of concept and how this might relate to the clinical pathway and the regulatory pathway?
There's a lot of confusion around what a proof of concept device is. People tend to confuse proof of concept with engineering prototype, because the engineering prototype is on the pathway to what will become the commercial product, whereas often a proof of concept is a very simplistic device and in many cases a throwaway device. So it's really important to not set your heart on doing a proof of concept as perhaps a quick and dirty to prove the bare minimum viability of your concept and expect that to follow through to ultimately evolve into your deployable product. And on the topic of clinical trials, I've had a number of occasions where a potential client has come to Genesis and say, we want to do a proof of concept to do clinical trials. The two terms are like oil and water. And a more appropriate thought might be, we want to do a proof of concept to do some preclinical evaluation to prove that our bright idea is in fact something that's useful to the marketplace. But that is not a clinical trial. Clinical trials are undertaken on the market-ready product at the end of the process. And it's really important not to confuse the two.
So we won't talk too much about clinical trials other than to point out that a lot of people think of clinical trials in terms of pharmaceutical products and so forth, but the same essential process is required for any active medical device as well. And then I guess the large sort of big bucket that a lot of people often don't think about is the whole quality systems aspect of it. It's considered I guess the biggest burden in developing active medtech products. If they weren't medical products, then almost half the work could be done away with. But because of the quality systems that are required and the proof required for getting regulatory compliance, there is a whole heap of work that has to be done. And quite often when people approach Genesis and come to us with an idea for a product, they come up with a fairly naive idea that they just want the product. They want to be able to use it for themselves, quite often for, say, a chain of cosmetic stores. It would be a good example. And they quite often, and they might have an idea of wanting to sell it to other customers, but what they don't realize is that in order to do that, they need to be what we call an ISO 13485 certified manufacturer of medical devices. And to have this quality system established at your organization is a huge task, which again we'll leave for another webinar, but just wanting to raise it now in this overview. Here are some of the key decision points that we see in the products that we are assisting our clients develop. I guess one of the first ones is just touching on what we talked about there with the quality systems. Every medical device needs to have a product sponsor, or in some of the other jurisdictions called a manufacturer of record. Somebody has to take responsibility for the product. Now, if you're going to manufacture it yourself, then you will need to have these quality systems in-house. However, quite a few people start never intending to do that, and they aim to sell to a third party down the track. Now, where this can become a trap for players really is around the documentation, because there is a real temptation at the bottom of the screen there. If you're thinking you're going to sell to a third party, is we'll just bypass all this annoying and burdensome documentation, or at least delay it until well after our minimum viable product, where we've attracted some interest and potential investment. However, one of the things with active medical devices, particularly in the software side of things, is that any work you do without documentation is essentially worthless. It has to be actually redone with documentation in parallel with the development work, starting with the identification of user requirements. So that is an initial burden right up front if you make the decision to start documentation early, but it really does save you a lot of effort down the track. Similarly with intellectual property, there is a big decision whether you are going to patent the product. Now, a lot of funding sources won't touch a product unless it's got patent protection, including government grants. But for some kinds of devices where I guess first mover advantage is more important, it can be feasible to develop it as a trade secret. And one thing people should realize about electronics is that quite often it's very difficult to get things that are patentable. Most of the IP comes from, I guess, the algorithms or the something to do with the way the device operates that's truly novel. Be wary of anybody who tells you that developing some fancy or good electronics is going to give you a patentable position. That's usually not the case. And if that's what you're relying on, if you've got something that isn't really truly novel, and you're going to market on the basis of some great software and hardware and making it accessible with an app or something, that may well not be patentable. And finally, another decision you really need to think about, and that relates to the jurisdiction, the regulatory strategy about which country you're going to get your device first certified in, is are you actually looking to export this globally? Because that comes with it a whole lot of design considerations, because different Europe and the US and China Japan, a whole lot of other countries all have different regulations around radio frequency spectrum, licensing and so forth that needs to be taken into account. And if you're just going to play in Australia, then that's obviously a lot easier. But Jeff, any comments on this particular screen?
I think the main thing is up front to consider these issues and have an in-principle plan in place, and not follow the approach that bit's difficult, so I'll worry about it later. It's best to, right up front, address these things. If you're uncertain about how to proceed, then seek advice and at least have an in-principle plan in place. I guess another way of putting it is make sure that you end up knowing what you don't know and working out which things you really need to get your ducks in a row in vis-a-vis things where there is some flexibility that you can address later on.
Okay, so just to give you a sense of how the product development process works for active medical devices, generally speaking, at least from our perspective, there are sort of three key players that work very, very closely together. That's the industrial designer up front, and we'll talk a little bit more about what they do later on, but they essentially conceptualize what the device would look like and how it would work. The electronics and software aspect is something that sort of spans the whole spectrum of it. We get involved to a higher or lesser degree at the front end, depending on to what extent the product relies on the electronics for its effectiveness. And then obviously the device needs to be manufactured at the end of the day. At the bottom of the screen there, you can see some, sort of common steps on the way, and throughout this webinar series we'll be delving into that in more detail. But a point that we should raise is that the more you sort of begin to look into it, the more you realize that there are a whole lot of people who need to be involved. If you're working with the university, for example, or an in-house team doing R&D, they're involved. People who are going to take the product to market, the operations people need to be involved. The regulatory strategy people need to be involved. There might be a packaging company involved. The list goes on and on. And so what we've done here at Genesis is we've put together a bit of a map of all of the tasks and all the players involved. At the top and the bottom of the screen there are the actual generally the organisations that are involved, and you may not be able to read that in close detail. We do have a white paper on this which we have developed, and if you contact us, we'll show the email at the end, we can send you this the white paper with this diagram in it. But I guess the key point to note about all those different players and different service providers in the bubble is that most service providers cater to 2 or 3 of these categories. So even though we've identified about 40 odd categories of service that provide assistance in developing medical devices, generally speaking, you'll end up working with sort of 6 or 7 of those because of the overlap, and some of them do 2 or 3 services. At the bottom of the screen there is essentially the technical pathway, so the design and development aspects, and we won't go into the detail in this overview, but there's a whole heap of particular tasks that need to be done in order to bring the product to life. Running in parallel with that, at the top of the screen is the business pathway, which can include the considerations around funding, regulations, intellectual property, and so forth. And generally all that comes together at the end of the process when you're transitioning into actually production of the device. Any comments on this slide, Jeff?
This is a complex slide, and it's not the intention today to expect any of the audience to get fully across what is on the screen. But the objective of our community is to, in fact, explore all of the topics and all of the boxes. And the further you get to the right, the more stringent the regulatory requirements become and the more complex things tend to be. So no apologies for this being a complex diagram. I'll actually quote Albert Einstein, who said, things should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And to my mind, this is about as simple as it gets in terms of what needs to be addressed to take a medical product from concept through to market. It is not simple, it is quite complex and quite onerous.
Okay, so just to give you a sense of some of the particular considerations that relate to active devices, obviously you have got a basic choice there about how you're going to power it via batteries or mains. And there are good reasons for that, particularly relating to safety and how you might be able to isolate a patient from electrical shock or dangers. Any comments on that, Jeff?
Just to comment on that, there's a standard IC 60601-1, which is covering safety aspects of medical devices, including function and electrical safety. If you go for an enclosed battery pad solution with no external electrical contacts, about half of that standard becomes not applicable. So you can dramatically reduce the regulatory compliance burden for electrical safety by avoiding having mains connected to the device whilst it's being used on a patient. And there are other areas where some fairly simple design decisions that might go one way or the other in terms of the use of the product and its convenience, for example, that can have a huge impact for its regulatory compliance. So it is important to make the sort of that decision and the other decisions that we see on the screen with knowledge of what the regulatory compliance burden will be resulting from those decisions.
Sure. And and of course we all know that the data is the new currency, and there are some big decisions to be made about how to manage data being generated by the device and how to communicate that. The concept of edge processing really is that you put as much smarts and intelligence into the actual device as you can. And the microprocessors these days are so powerful that you can do some extremely complicated algorithmic work on the device, make smart decisions on the device, and then only, I guess, communicate the results. On the other hand, there's a great trend generally across the entire what we call Internet of Things field, is to really just send the data up to the cloud and then use the incredible processing power that's available in the cloud now, vis-a-vis machine learning and artificial intelligence and all kinds of things. But as I said earlier, that really raises the question of whether that third-party cloud software is in fact a medical device. When would that software up in the cloud be a medical device, Jeff?
Once again, it comes to the use case. If you're using that data for a diagnostic purpose or to back up a therapeutic purpose, it typically will become a medical device. And this applies not just to the cloud, but also to mobile devices. So, for example, a mobile device where a medical practitioner is monitoring the well-being of a marathon runner doing a race, that can become a medical device because a medical outcome is contingent upon the use of that software.
Okay, and again, on a similar vein, you can have the user interface, you can have a screen, an LCD screen or something like that on the device itself, and that will make it really simple if that's the only interface. On the other hand, you might want to connect it to have a mobile app, is obviously very trendy. So I guess the same would apply for that.
And there's also a topic for another day, which is regulatory compliance of medical device software. And there is a hidden trap that if you are using a platform that's a commercial grade platform, you then have to consider the software on it. And there's a thing called SOUP, software of unknown provenance, which is a huge minefield. So if you're developing a safety critical device, you may well consider having the primary user interface, an LCD screen on the device so that you can fully control and develop the software to be compliant with the medical standard for the software and not have a problem arising from third-party software of unknown provenance.
And finally, relating again back to your global strategy, is the whole distribution strategy because you might have different requirements for different countries around the electronics and software side of things. So does that mean you have multiple versions of your product? Or can you have a base version and then just plug in some modules that make it work in the different countries? So these are just sort of touching the surface of some of the technical considerations that make active medical devices very different from other kinds of medical technologies. As we mentioned, really the big difference between medical devices and others is the regulatory burden. And in the active space, there is a whole raft of standards that you need to be across. We're just going to briefly, as an introduction, touch on some of these particular standards. I guess the headline one is the quality management system. I've mentioned a few times already, ISO 13485. That's what you need in place to be a medical device manufacturer. And if you're going to the in-house route, you'll certainly need to have that in-house. What makes it really easy is if all of the companies that are providing services to you, like your electronics designer, your industrial designer, your manufacturer, and so forth, if they are also ISO 13485 certified for their particular aspect, so Genesis is for design only, CircuitWise is for manufacturing only, and so forth. If they've already got these systems in place, it makes the process for having your product certified at the end of the day a lot easier. Can you explain that, Jeff?
Yeah, and I just note the fourth dot point is electromagnetic compatibility, not electromagnet compatibility.
My apologies.
Getting an ISO 13485 quality system in place is quite burdensome and expensive, and I would suggest, particularly to a startup, don't try and do that at the beginning, because firstly, it's going to distract you from your early stage development work, and secondly, you're not really going to know enough about your product to be able to do it effectively. So one strategy to consider pursuing, and of course I'm being a little self-serving in this, is to consider engaging with teaming partners who can help you with the development, who have their systems in place already. You can effectively piggyback on their systems for all the technical work and transfer that outputs of that work in under your quality umbrella well down the track. So you're effectively relying on your suppliers to have the quality management systems backed up by know-how and process and procedures to effectively undertake that part of the activity for you in the early stages. This allows you to firstly learn, secondly to get your quality system in place, engage with a quality system consultant to help you establish it. And at the point where you are ready to go to market, you can then transfer all of the design information from your suppliers under your own quality system umbrella. And I guess we won't go through the other standards in any detail here, but we will have future webinars effectively looking at each of those standards under the dot points and addressing what they mean and how to deal with them. I guess the takeaway from today is that it is incredibly important to make sure that from day one, you understand that you need to comply with these standards and have a pathway in place to achieve that.
Okay, so just touching on probably industrial design is critical in active medtech. Virtually all of our projects, we work very closely in this space with an industrial designer who is also ISO 13485 certified. The interplay between the electronics and the casing that it's in, the mechanical aspects of the device, it's really just backwards and forwards, constantly iterating between different aspects of the device. For example, a button to turn something on and off on a device could be considered an electrical switch, but it also might need to have be of something that is waterproof or has biocompatibility, so that it doesn't pose a danger or leach, the materials aspect of it is very important as well. Obviously the ergonomics and how the electronics can be made to fit within that, the usability of it, particularly when you get to any apps or screens that are being used, then the electronics needs to be able to have a data model that services the app. So there is this constant backwards and forwards and play. And at the end of the day, you need to manufacture a physical device, and so you need the materials and the tooling. And so generally a manufacturer will take both a brief from the electronics designer for the manufacture of the printed circuit boards and the loading up of the firmware and the software. But they'll also take a brief from the industrial designer about how to actually manufacture any of the hardware that's involved. And they also need to go through a very rigorous risk management verification process as well. I'll touch also on the manufacturing side of things. And generally speaking, what most people are really interested in is what is the unit cost of the end device going to be? That consists of two broad components. One, the actual cost of the physical device, the components, the plastics and the wiring and how it's all put together. And that includes the testing time. And one thing that a lot of people don't sort of think through is that the testing time itself could cost more than the unit cost. So, you might spend a whole lot of time shaving, a few cents or a few dollars off the physical cost of the unit. But if you neglect the testing, all of that effort in having a very efficient manufacturing design can be wasted if it takes you sort of 15 minutes to test each unit and you're paying somebody, quite a bit of money to do that testing. So that's a really important thing that needs to be brought to bear in the design. And likewise with the assembly, if you're painfully manufacturing things together with screws rather than clipping them together with, plastic hooks and so forth, then again, the assembly time can take a lot of time and add to the cost. So that unit cost ends up being a component of the actual hardware cost, component cost, testing, assembly, and then you generally will amortize all of the design costs across the life of the product. A key aspect of any medical device is traceability, and that's knowing exactly where each component came from and where it's gone. And the same also applies from the point of view from design traceability. Did you want to just briefly comment on design traceability, Jeff?
Yeah, effectively, the medical regulatory standard requires the developer to trace from user needs, which is the fundamental statement of what the user wants the product to do, through all the technical design documentation and right through to verification and validation testing, and ultimately to product testing and manufacture. So you need to have all of these requirements traceable so that you make sure that every user need has been verified and validated, and conversely that the design hasn't got built in a whole heap of gold plating that the user didn't actually want. Just final comment on the acronyms at the bottom: reduction of hazardous substances and REACH is a part of that, and WE is waste, electrical and electronic equipment disposal. These are just some standards that apply particularly in Europe for manufacturing, and it's important to have cognizance of those and make sure that you're compliant to, if you particularly are going to sell into Europe.
Yes, so these kinds of things can come as a surprise at the end of the day for a lot of people. So we're getting towards the end now, and I just want to make everyone aware that there's at the bottom of your screen, if you wave your mouse over your screen, at the bottom of the screen you should see a little question and answers tab come up. We'd really encourage you, if you've got questions, to start typing them in now so that we've got a few questions at the end of the webinar. But just to summarize, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the things that really, really help is right from the start is being really clear about what it is that your device is meant to do and how the users, what it needs to do for the users to be used effectively. We are constantly surprised by people who, despite having spent quite a lot of time developing an idea, really haven't ever documented this very clearly. So that's just something that you should really, I guess, start with. The second thing we find that is a real problem is that a lot of people just really don't have any realistic idea of what the timescale is from concept of production, and as a consequence, what the realistic idea of what the costs are. Some people think that getting an MVP grant for $50,000 is fantastic because that's going to set them on the path to success. But a $50,000 MVP grant should be better used as a proof of concept grant, which needs to be thrown away. It's just clearly inadequate to get anywhere near a minimum viable product. And medical devices can often cost in the order of millions of dollars to get developed, and take on average sort of anything from 6 months to 2 years. So that's the kind of time frame that people should be thinking about and just be aware of. We've talked a little bit about already about the unrealistic expectations of proof of concept. A lot of people develop something on their own using what we call single board computers with like Raspberry Pi or Arduino. And generally speaking, they cannot be used at all in terms of developing a medical device. You generally have to start again because all of the work just in that is can't be used for regulatory compliance purposes. And they're also they don't translate to a commercially scalable electronics design either. That's what I was really meant by that prototyping platform in the second point there. And I guess the final point there is there's this really strong desire to leave the regulatory compliance aspects until later. In fact, quite a lot of consultants will actually advise this. And these are usually consultants who are steeped in the world of what they call minimum viable product, which might very well work for consumer products that have a fairly low regulatory burden. But the MVP ethos is not an excuse for cheap and cheerful. It's meant to make the development process, I guess, leaner and more efficient, but it doesn't avoid the end requirement for compliance. So the earlier you start thinking about what your pathway to regulatory compliance is and start your documentation and not leave things till later, the easier the whole process will be. And the ugly, really, we find a lot of people who run out of money and projects that stop halfway through because they just, they had some initial raisings and they ran out of money. So that just happens all the time. Jeff, do you want to talk about uncontrolled development and how that affects the overall product development lifecycle?
The medical quality requirements have built in a concept called product life cycle, and it's actually very explicit for the software and not so explicit for the hardware, but it is implied. And this means that to end up with a compliant design, you have to start with planning at day one. So you can't take the concept, I'll just develop this willy-nilly and then partway through get the compliance people to do all that stuff for me. It simply doesn't work when you look at the fact that you have to start with planning and specification right at the get-go under the control of what's called the life cycle model. And if you don't do that, you simply can't backfill or retrofit later. And so really it causes a great deal of grief not starting with the so-called design controls right at the beginning of the development.
Yes, and you may as well explain these last 2 points because they're all sort of tied up with that, isn't it?
Yeah, well, product safety we touched upon with ISO 60601-1 and risk management ISO 14971. These are mandated standards that are called up as being applicable to medical products. And in particular, risk management should be done for any product development, but normally not done in a formal manner. There is an obligation to do risk management in a formal manner and within the context of risk being risk of harm to patients, users, or the environment. And there are formalised requirements for that must be undertaken. In terms of regulatory compliance submissions, it's all linked to the above. There is a particularly burdensome requirement to submit or have available information to submit for CE. Also for the US, for a 510K submission, there are defined requirements. And these submissions are underpinned by all of the regulatory compliance and other technical documentation that is produced during the whole development cycle of the product. So you probably get the impression from what I'm saying that these things are all intertwined and enmeshed. And if you want to be able to come up with a coherent regulatory compliance submission at the end, you have to start working on that right at the beginning.
Okay, so that's the end of our overview. We hope you found that useful. We'll go to questions and answers now. As I said, at the bottom of the screen there, you can see that little icon that you can type in your questions, and I'll just open up the screen now. So we've got a question here from Matt, who asks, what are your thoughts on the medtech space, including skills and capability, particularly in relation to New South Wales versus Victoria, and also versus the rest of the world?
Well, looking at New South Wales versus Victoria, Victoria has had a long-established companies offering design and development services in the medical space, whereas New South Wales tends to have been dominated by the 500-pound gorillas, the ResMeds and the Cochlears, who are complete self-contained companies. It's only over the last few years that companies like Genesis, CircuitWise, Design and Industry as an industrial designer, have started popping up with ISO 13485. So we are playing catch-up to the extent of reputation in the marketplace, but I would contend that the companies who are now able to participate in New South Wales are more than a match from the ones in Melbourne. So the old Victoria or Melbourne-Sydney contest, I think Sydney is well positioned now to start to win that battle. In terms of the rest of the world, I would take quality companies in Australia and stand them up against anything on the planet and say that they are at least equal, if not superior, in terms of skills and capabilities. In terms of size, obviously, we can't compete.
Sure. And I'll just make one comment about that on the manufacturing side of things as well, because there's been obviously a trend in recent years to outsource things to Asia, find designers in Asia, but more particularly manufacturers in Asia. And having worked quite a bit with CircuitWise recently, we know for a fact that we are reaching price parity with Asia in terms of manufacturing if you have a good design. So we'll talk more about this when we get to our manufacturing webinar in a couple of months' time. But if you have a single-sided board, a board with only surface mount components and very few or no surface mount, what we call through-hole or hand-placed components, then it is actually cheaper to get it manufactured in Australia. And we've actually had some sort of documented proof from clients recently, 4% cheaper than a straight up dollar for dollar quote from the Philippines. So really the days when, everybody assumed that it was cheaper in Asia really has gone, and that's been a result of advances in design and advances in manufacturing technologies. I've got a question for Luke here. Assuming the regulation is to ensure the safety of a medical design, why does the regulatory compliance process start at a very, very early stage, e.g. in the planning design? Can you just help me understand the ethos of why it is so strict?
Yeah, that's quite a complicated question, but the fundamental underpinning requirement is to ensure safety of the product. And of course, any product on the market needs to be safe for not electrocuting people, for example. But for a medical device, the safety requirements are effectively multiplied in terms of their extent. So looking at electrical safety, we not only have to not electrocute people, but there are requirements to reduce leakage currents to extremely low levels that are much more stringent, for example, than for a normal consumer product. Then when we consider the use of the product, firstly, the device has to not cause any harm in its use on a patient. And secondly, it has to achieve its therapeutic or diagnostic outcome so the patient doesn't suffer harm from the device failing to do what it's supposed to do. So what this means is a very significant safety burden for a medical device vis-a-vis a commercial device. Firstly, in the software having to be proven to be safe. Secondly, in materials compatibility, so as not to cause potential harm to someone through materials contamination, particularly if you're looking at sterilisation and cleanliness requirements, that becomes a large burden. And then in terms of usability, can the people using the device use it effectively on the patient they're using it on? So taking all these things together adds up to quite a formidable requirement that eclipses anything that you'll find for the safety of a consumer product, for example. Reason to start early, firstly, to understand what you're facing so that you know that you have a large compliance burden, particularly in verification, validation and clinical trials that you need to fund. So you make sure you have a plan in place to get that funding. Secondly, to come up with a sound design that you can do risk management on, that you can do verification and validation, means at the very start, the engineering of that design has to feed into that process. One way of looking at it, if in doing a hardware and software design, you apply industry best practice in your design approach, that aligns extremely well in the early stages with what the medical regulations require. So one way of viewing it is to say, let's not get hung up on complying with all these regulations. Let's just make sure we design and develop the product to be as good as it can be, applying best practice. And that will actually align with what the medical regulatory compliance's requirements dictate and mandate. In a particular case of software, because it has a life cycle requirement, if you do not start at day one, you simply can't produce compliant software. So the standard mandates that. It's a long-winded answer to what is an extremely complicated question, and that warrants a webinar, yeah, a full webinar in its own right.
And I guess to say that in another way, you can't do it retrospectively. So you can't develop your software and then say, oh, I'll go back and do the documentation later.
No, it's just the standard requires you to have planning artifacts in place that you have followed, and even for the overall product development, there's a requirement for a design and development plan. So your quality auditor or your compliance auditor will be asking to see those plans and make sure that they were in place and dated at a date before you started the development. And if that's not the case, you simply won't pass your compliance audits.
Yeah, and I guess the key message there is, you know, you can spend years getting into it and you find an auditor who finds one thing wrong with it. And at the best case, it can delay your certification by months, or in worst case, force you to go back and start again. So yes, unfortunately, you do have to think about these things. Here's another question from an anonymous attendee. So somebody who didn't, obviously the URL's been passed on from somebody, but that's fine because it's all free. For a startup, what are the key personnel required to get a product developed and up to regulatory approval? And secondly, in general, how much does a typical class 2 medical device cost to get approval, and what categories of cost do these belong to? They're two very separate questions. So let's start with the product personnel. And that's a really great question, because we see a lot of our clients who start off with 1 or 2 people, and typically they've got sort of almost up to about 10 employees by the time they go to market, haven't they?
Indeed.
Can you talk about what those people are and what makes sense to keep in-house to your team, and what makes sense to, I guess, outsource?
And there are some key roles to be fulfilled. But for a startup, I would counsel against trying to set up a team from day one to cover all the skills bases. I would focus on the ones that are most important early on, and then engage with consultants or people who can give you advice to assist you with those other aspects, but then plan to bring those resources in-house as required. So right at the very beginning, you obviously need someone with a clear knowledge and vision of what the product is, what it is intended to do. And that includes the clinical aspects. So if it's a device to be used by surgeons, you need to have surgeons who are going to end up being the end users giving advice. It's going to be just a general practitioner, then you need that skill set from the clinical side. From a technical perspective, you obviously need someone who can get their head around the requirements for the electronics hardware and also the software. So you might end up on your team having an electronics hardware designer and perhaps a software designer if you are not intending to outsource those skills. And I guess in terms of the quality system and regulatory compliance aspects, you need to at least have personnel with the knowledge of what they're facing down the track so that they can then undertake meaningful dialogue with consultants and advisors.
Jeff, one of the things that I've heard you often talk about, and perhaps a more another way of phrasing this question, which will be really helpful, is to say it's not sort of what are the roles that are required. It's more like what are the attitudes that are required of the individuals, because you can have a virtual company where you actually outsource absolutely everything. You have one person, with the idea at the middle, but obviously they need project management skills, but they also need a certain attitude in terms of rigor and, not cutting corners. And, can you describe what the general attitudes that are required of these people?
It's an attitude and a mindset thing. Firstly, you need to accept that a medical product needs to meet regulatory and compliance requirements, and that's unavoidable. So you say, okay, we need to do this. How do we approach this and go about it? And at the very early stages, it's critical that the whole team have a mindset that we need to come up with a compliant design, and we need to apply the appropriate rigors to achieve that. Counter to that, we don't want to, if we're in a research and development phase or doing a proof of concept, we don't want to get bogged down so that all our dollars go on regulatory matters and we don't end up doing any technical development work. So there is a balance to be met. But if the team has a mindset of accepting that there is a requirement for rigor and discipline, learning to know what we don't know and having a plan to learn it as we need to know it is a good start. So really that comes down to a mindset. And in terms of thought processes, I like to think not in terms of targeting compliance with regulatory standards. I like to think in terms of let's come up with a safe, effective, high quality design. So if you take that second pathway, to a degree, the regulatory compliance will start to look after itself.
So in another way, don't take shortcuts, because otherwise you'll be in a world of pain.
And don't take shortcuts. But by the same token, don't become bogged down and burdened with minutiae.
Yeah.
And really importantly, make sure that if you're not clear in your own mind what you're facing and what you have to do, then seek advice.
Now, the second part of that question was, in general, how much does it cost for a typical Class 2 medical device to get approval, and what categories of cost do these belong to? I'm not quite sure I understand a bit about the categories, but
I can certainly address that.
Yes.
The things that are usually obvious, and if you're developing a commercial level product, designing the electronics hardware, designing and developing the software, and getting everything to work as an engineering prototype. And you might be looking at maybe between $200,000 and $500,000 to develop a moderately complex electronic software-based device for a commercial environment. We start to overlay on top of that the costs for a medical device. You can easily double that by the time you add in all of the medical regulatory compliance documentation, the risk management, the verification, validation, just to get to a point where the hardware and software meets its technical requirements. We then have on top of that costs for doing clinical trials, and that can be extensive.
Well, actually, before that, you've got the industrial design.
Oh, you've got I didn't add in the industrial design, and depending on the complexity of the product, that can be the same sort of order of the electronics, if it's a complex mechanism, or if it's a simple box, it might be quite inexpensive. But nevertheless needs to be included.
Then you'd have the regulatory area is also quite.
Then you have the
quality system.
Quality system and a regulatory compliance pathway, and people can easily spend $1 million getting a medical quality system in place. Can be done much more inexpensively. So we're starting to talk big dollars, and I would say for a class 2 device that's got relatively complex function, might have some mechanical actuation and control mechanisms rather than just a simple enclosure, and maybe having significant clinical trial, it's easy to start to spend between $3 and $5 million to get a medical device ready to go onto the market.
Yeah. And can I make a comment on that, Jeff, is that, you know, these numbers, when you first hear them, you know, you might just have this idea in your mind. They sound very daunting. But actually, when if you start with the premise that your idea is actually a good idea and that there's a viable market for it, then actually these numbers, that money is easily available. You know, there are grants all over the place. And if, from an investor's point of view, they see that it's a good idea and it's feasible, the one other thing they're looking for really is to minimise their risk. And the way they minimise their investment risk is having the confidence that you know what you're talking about. And that's where engaging, you know, really skilled service providers early on can help, because like for, you know, if we're just talking from the electronics point of view, one of the things that we do early on is, you know, run a requirements workshop and do a technical specification. And that gives a really clearly defined, documented piece of evidence to say, this is what it is. And it actually has a fairly accurate assessment of how much the electronics and software is going to cost, which is a bankable kind of product. What investors don't like are people coming up saying, hey, I've got this great idea, it can do this or this, here's my little prototype in Arduino. But you've got no quotes from an actual designer, you've got no visibility and so forth. So you can actually bootleg your way up the investment scale by a moderate investment up front in order to get accurate quotes to start with, and then actually there are different stages in which the costs get increasingly clarified over time. So generally speaking, getting that sourcing of funding is eminently achievable. You know, if you've got a good team around you and the investors are confident that you and your team know what they're talking about. Okay. We've got a question here which somebody's obviously maybe sitting at home watching this webinar on their lounge chair with an electrical, footrest, and they're asking, what's the difference between an electrical hospital bed and an electrical lounge chair at home?
Well, there are two ways to approach this. Excuse me. From a medical compliance point of view, it is purely the use case. A bed in a hospital is being used on patients for therapeutic benefit and will affect their health outcomes depending on its function. Vis-a-vis electrical sofa bed at home is there to keep you comfortable. So the use cases are quite different. The medical regulatory compliance requirements apply to hospital use, but not home use. In terms of the more fundamental differences between the uses of the devices, at home, the sofa bed is being used normally by a healthy person purely to maintain their comfort. In a hospital, the bed is being used on a patient who may be suffering a critical injury or a critical condition, and the function of that bed could in fact determine whether they live or die at the extreme. So the use scenarios are just so fundamentally different that the requirement for the medical compliance becomes quite clear cut. Okay, look, unfortunately we've gone past 1 o'clock now. We do want to keep our webinars to 1 hour, so we'll have to wrap it up there.